Welcome, everyone. We'll get started here in just a second. All right. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today for the release of The Uncertain Ammonia Industry, Present and Future, the latest report from the Ohio River Valley Institute. My name is Ben Hunkler. I am the comms manager for Orvi, and if you haven't encountered our work before, we are an independent research organization helping the Ohio River Valley region chart a course toward shared prosperity, clean energy, and more equitable civic structures. Today's report is co-authored by Orvi Research Fellows Zane Gustafson, Eric DePlace, and Julia Stone, and it takes a broad look at the past, present, and future of the ammonia industry. The report describes how ammonia has traditionally been made from fossil fuels in a process that's very carbon intensive, and it weighs the merits and limits of new proposals to decarbonize ammonia production. It also takes a look at the surge of at least 37 ammonia projects proposed for construction across the country and how those projects might fare as the market for ammonia continues to shift. We're also super grateful to be joined today by Mariah Clay, who is the Southern West Virginia organizer with the West Virginia Rivers Coalition and a resident of Mingo County, West Virginia, where Transgas is developing its Adams Fork Energy Project, a blue ammonia plant that, if built, would surpass CF Industries' Donaldsonville complex in Louisiana to become the largest ammonia producing facility in the world. Mariah is leading efforts to inform their community of the public health and environmental harms this facility could impose on frontline residents, and we will hear from them later in today's program about the Adams Fork Project and the work they're doing to keep their community apprised. So we'll get started with Zane, who will give us a presentation of the report's key findings in just a moment. And at the end of today's program, we'll have some time for questions and answers. Feel free to drop those questions or comments in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we will get to them in the order that they are received. And then lastly, I just want to mention that today's program is being recorded, and you should have access to closed captions at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to send me a message if you need anything, and I will now turn it over to Zane.
Thanks, Ben. All right. Okay, thank you, Ben, and thank you to everyone for being here today. I'm so excited to present to you all. My name is Zane Gustafson. I'm the lead author of this report on the present and future of the ammonia industry. Thank you so much to my co-authors, Eric DePlace and Julia Stone. And thank you to everyone at Orvi for editorial and logistical support and for putting this event together today. So let's get into it. I'd like to start by sharing the key findings of the report, and then I'll get into some of the specifics. So first, ammonia production is currently highly carbon intensive. This is the global market, and almost 90% of ammonia produced globally is used as fertilizer. This is important as a starting point for the future of the industry, which is highly uncertain. Future growth projections vary by almost an order of magnitude, and the new ammonia markets are dependent on how quickly nascent technologies are adopted. That's the global 30,000-foot view. Focusing here in the US, there has been an explosion of proposed ammonia projects which seek to take advantage of low carbon hydrogen production tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act. If built on schedule, these projects would more than quadruple domestic ammonia production in less than a decade. Most of these projects are blue ammonia facilities, like the Adams Fork project in West Virginia, which, like Ben said, would be the largest ammonia facility in the world if it is built. These blue ammonia projects rely on yet unproven carbon capture and sequestration technology. And then finally, zero carbon green ammonia. It can be produced, which could be really exciting, but it requires massive amounts of renewable electricity. So Just to get started, as a baseline, let me explain how ammonia is produced currently with the Haber-Bosch process that was invented about 100 years ago. There are three parts of this process. Haber-Bosch combined hydrogen and nitrogen under heat and pressure to produce ammonia, which is one nitrogen atom combined with three hydrogen atoms, which you can see at the bottom of the graphic here. Um, you can also see the fossil fuel path line outlined in gray and the zero carbon pathway outlined in green. The blue pathway is an offshoot of the gray pathway and shows how carbon capture and sequestration fits into the equation. So the most energy intensive part of producing ammonia is producing hydrogen. You can think of ammonia production as an extension of hydrogen production. The green circles show how much electricity is needed to produce the component parts for 1 metric ton of ammonia. You can see that it takes 9.1 megawatt hours of electricity to produce hydrogen from electrolysis, which uses feedstock, water as feedstock, excuse me. While it takes less than 1/10 of 1 megawatt hour to produce the nitrogen required. That's because nitrogen is just in the air. It's very easy to get. The heat required for this process takes another about half a megawatt of electricity. So you can see that producing green ammonia is essentially about producing green hydrogen, which accounts for over 90% of the total electricity use. But right now, almost all of the ammonia produced in the US is produced along the steam methane reforming process noted in the gray pathway, which is powered by natural gas and using natural gas as feedstock to produce hydrogen. I can go into the chemistry later if people are interested, but the main takeaway is that it takes about 32,000 cubic feet of natural gas to produce 1 metric ton of ammonia. And in total, this emits about 2.35 metric tons of carbon dioxide per metric ton of ammonia. So in 2023, the US produced 14 million tons of ammonia, resulting in 31 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions, which is equivalent to more than 7 million gas-powered cars on the road for a year. So theoretically, gray ammonia production can be turned blue through carbon capture and sequestration. And that's also known as CCS, which many of you probably know. So the CCS rate usually claimed by blue ammonia projects to qualify for the hydrogen production tax credit is 95%, meaning that these projects claim that they will capture and sequester 95% of their emissions. But CCS rates this high have not been proven yet at commercial scale. A 2023 study by the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis found no evidence of CCS at even an 80% capture rate. So at least for the present, the blue ammonia pathway merits a lot of skepticism. So next slide, please. So let's take a look at where ammonia is currently produced. There are 31 operational ammonia plants with a total capacity of 18 million metric tons per year. So the letters and numbers next to each of these dots correspond to a table, which you can find in the report if you want to get into the details. And all of these plants produce gray ammonia, and their total production was 14 million metric tons out of 18 million tons of capacity. So you can see that there's a lot of plants in the plains states, but the top three states in terms of capacity are Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Texas. And Louisiana alone has 33% of current ammonia production capacity. So let's look at where the next plants are going to be, or the proposed plants could be. This is a map of 37 proposed plants as of October 2024. And so this is these things are changing pretty quickly, so this may already be a little bit out of date, but the point still stands here, which is that you can see the plants are highly concentrated along the Gulf Coast in Louisiana and Texas. The blue dots correspond to blue ammonia plants, green corresponds to green ammonia plants. So blue ammonia plants are 26 of the 37 plants and would account for about 90% of new capacity. So this means they would still be powered by natural gas and use natural gas as feedstock. And the biggest proposed plant is the one highlighted by that red arrow, which is the Adams Fork project in West Virginia. So let's talk about Adams Fork. If it is built, Adams Fork would be the largest ammonia plant in the world with a capacity of 13 million metric tons per year. And just to remember, I've said it a couple of times already, but the entire annual production of ammonia in the US last year was 14 million metric tons. So this plant would double ammonia production on its own. It would consume 65 billion cubic feet of natural gas per year as feedstock. Now, Adams Fork claims that it would capture 99.3% of its carbon emissions using novel technology, which includes using the excess heat from the second of the chemical reactions in the steam methane reforming process to power the plant's operation. But this claim should be treated skeptically. To reiterate my earlier point, commercial scale CCS has yet to be proven at this rate. Um, Financially, Adams Fork depends on receiving 45V hydrogen production tax credits, but guidance from the Treasury Department in January specifically rejects the accounting method Adams Fork plans on using. Um, and this is a developing situation as we see how regulations and accounting may or may not be enforced by the new administration, but I am skeptical about Adams Fork's viability. And this is in part because Adams Fork would be part of a massive increase in US production capacity. It would be competing against a bunch of other ammonia producers as they all come online within a few years of each other. If all the proposed plants are built to their full capacity, the US would go from 18 million metric tons of capacity to 80 million in less than a decade, more than quadruple. And as you can see from the bar on the right, about 90% of that capacity would be blue ammonia, and just a small portion would be green. Next slide, please. Yes. So beyond the tax credits, the other driver of this build out is projected growth in ammonia demand. And there's potentially a huge growth in demand. So this graph shows three different projections of growth from 2020 to 2050. The existing market in purple represents demand for fertilizers and also other things like plastics, explosives, and petrochemicals. So in 2020, that amounted to about 185 million metric tons globally. And you can see that in the kind of the gray shaded area down at the bottom there. The orange represents the new market, which would be ammonia used as a maritime fuel, as co-firing in coal plants, or as a carrier for hydrogen. And I'll get into those specifics on the next slide. But first, just take a look at how wide these projections are. Let's start with the IEA, which I find to be the most reasonable of these projections. The IEA projects the existing market to grow by about 25% from 2020 to 2050. And then the new ammonia market would be 125 million metric tons by 2050, which would be about 1/3 of total demand. So that seems like fairly reasonable to me. But the industry projections are way, way higher, as you can see. IRENA in the middle projects the new market could grow to 350 million metric tons by 2050, and that the existing market would grow by 75%. So way higher, way faster than the IEA. In the IRENA projection, the new market would be dominated by maritime fuel and ammonia as a hydrogen carrier. And then some of these projections I find, well, frankly, kind of ridiculous, which is this last one, which would the ammonia demand more than quintupling in just 30 years. This last projection takes place in a future in which everything goes right for the hydrogen production build out and all the technology required to make that demand a reality. But that is a lot of ifs there. So let's look into what this new ammonia market could look like. So there are three potential uses that future demand growth depends on. We'll talk about maritime fuel first. And ammonia as a maritime fuel is actually really exciting. This could be a way to decarbonize an entire sector of fossil fuel use because ammonia emits zero carbon when it is burned. Ammonia is about 40% as energy dense as fossil fuels. So ships would need to carry more fuel or refuel more often, but that's not the primary problem here. The issue is that producing that much zero carbon ammonia requires huge amounts of green electricity. The other issue is that it will require mass adoption of new ammonia engines, which are being built. Um, they're being tested right now, but uh, production has been repeatedly delayed. So, for example, in the IEA's 2021 ammonia technology roadmap, that report stated that development of ammonia-fueled engines was expected to be commercially available by 2024, but it's now 2025 and this hasn't happened yet. There are two companies, Wärtsilä and MAN, that are working on this, and they both have timelines to have these new engines tested this year. So this could be a real market for ammonia in the future, but the history of delays justifies skepticism about the speed of adoption. The second potential is ammonia as a co-firing fuel in coal plants, which is something I'm not nearly as excited about because from a carbon emissions perspective, because it essentially helps keep coal plants alive. Um, the way that this would work is it basically uses ammonia to replace some of the coal. So burning ammonia would reduce the carbon emissions of the coal plant. Um, but ammonia would need to replace 60% of the coal that is burned in a coal plant to reduce emissions below that of just burning the coal and doing CCS. Um, it really only makes sense if the ammonia is produced in a truly zero carbon fashion. The biggest proponents of this are in Japan and Korea, uh, but this technology is still being tested. Um, yeah. And so then lastly, ammonia can be used as a carrier for hydrogen, which could be very prevalent in a future potential hydrogen powered economy. Ammonia is more dense than hydrogen and much easier to transport. So basically, the way this would work is you produce ammonia, which is from hydrogen, produce hydrogen, then you produce ammonia from that hydrogen in one place. Then you ship it in specially designed ammonia ships. And then once you reach your destination, you crack the ammonia back into hydrogen and then ship that hydrogen to wherever it will be consumed. Um, but outside of specific use cases, I'm skeptical that this is a good use of energy. Um, because it only makes sense if the hydrogen and ammonia is produced using green electricity, which is very energy intensive. It might be a better use of green electricity to just use it as electricity wherever it's produced. Um, the other thing holding this back is that there's the logistical problem of building an entire new fleet of ammonia transport ships. This has already started happening. Companies have made these orders, um, but the transition will take time. So my skepticism here is not that it is unfeasible, or that it's not even useful in certain cases, but that it may not scale up as quickly as claimed by the industry. So uh, I'm not the only skeptic here. The industry is skeptical too. So Ben mentioned CF Industries. CF Industries is the largest ammonia producer on the planet, and their 2023 shareholder report has this passage. The market for green and low carbon ammonia may be slow to develop, may not develop to the size expected, or may not develop at all. We believe the demand for green and low carbon ammonia could take several years to materialize and then 10 or more years to fully develop and mature. And we cannot be certain that this market or the market for green and low carbon hydrogen will grow to the size or at the rate we expect or at all. And that really sums it up. Ammonia could be a real solution and a real part of a decarbonized economy. But right now, it doesn't look like it will be able to scale nearly as fast as projected. And in my view, it's mostly an excuse for gas companies to find other ways to sell their gas. So I'll leave you with three recommendations from the report. First is that ammonia and hydrogen should be used only for applications where there is no other cost-effective decarbonization alternative. Second, that policymakers should be skeptical of the industry's claims about how carbon-free ammonia production actually is. And third, the federal government should consider tightening rules and regulations on subsidies for hydrogen and ammonia projects. Producing zero carbon hydrogen and ammonia would be great, but it's long past time we stopped giving handouts to the fossil fuel industry. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions. Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much, Zane. Again, please do feel free to drop any questions or comments for Zane into the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get to those after Mariah gives us a little bit of background on their work organizing against the Adams Fork facility in Mingo County.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Mariah Clay. I work with West Virginia Rivers Coalition as Southern West Virginia Coordinator. The Adams Fork Blue Ammonia Facility is proposed in my hometown. The project is part of a broader push to expand ammonia production in the U.S. fueled by tax credits. But while these projects are marketed as clean energy solutions, the reality is they often place even greater burdens on already struggling communities. At West Virginia Rivers, our approach to community engagement recognizes the deep history of environmental harm in West Virginia. These communities we work with are not just fighting a single project, they are grieving a way of life lost to extraction, pollution, and industry driven displacement. This is why our engagement starts by addressing ecological grief, acknowledging the loss and the emotions that come with it. Without trust and shared understanding, there's no foundation for collective work and action. We structure this work around what we call the community engagement pyramid. So we start with trust and relationship building, addressing the grief, creating a sense of place and belonging, and forming a common narrative. So then we would work towards building collective power, identifying local leaders, fostering community organizing, and ensuring people have the tools to advocate for themselves. And then that would lead us to institutional power and outreach, engaging with decision makers, pushing for policy changes, and demanding accountability. I also think it's important to acknowledge that in many traditional engagement models, they overlook the realities of life in Southern West Virginia. People here are not just fighting a polluting industry, they are also fighting for basic survival. Thousands of community members in my county and the surrounding counties don't have access to clean and safe drinking water. And on top of that, environmental groups have historically come in, made promises, only to meet their funders' requirements and leave without creating meaningful, lasting change. That's why we hope to take a different approach. We focus on showing up and building relationships before a crisis happens. This means supporting local needs, like most recently, flood relief efforts. Strengthening community ties, like partnering with local watershed group, Friends of the Tug Fork River, and creating opportunities for connection, like partnering on a paddle camp for kids and folks who have never been on the river before, actively reshaping their relationship with their rivers. This long-term approach is crucial. At our first community meeting in Gilbert, West Virginia, my hometown, where the Adams Fork facility is proposed, more than 60 people, that's 20% of the town's population, showed up. They had real questions and real concerns. I heard many folks have concerns about water, where it will be sourced and what the wastewater management will consist of. I heard many concerns about present water issues and worry that this will add more issues to a problem that is already overflowing. For context, ammonia production has a 20-to-1 water penalty. For every 1 unit of ammonia produced, 20 units of water is needed. Many of the questions that were asked couldn't be answered that night. The Adams Fork Working Group took these questions back with us, and we have been working on a community-friendly guide to ensure that these residents have clear, accurate information about what this project means for them. Another question that we heard at that meeting was, why are you showing up now? That question matters. If we want to oppose these projects effectively, we must first prove that we are here to stay, not just for the battle, but for the long haul. Community engagement is not about stopping a single project. It's about rebuilding trust and collective power in places that have been ignored for far too long. If we want to challenge the industries harming our land and people, we have to start by standing with communities before a crisis happens, not just when we need them to show up for a fight, especially now as so many are navigating life after the devastating flooding. So thank you all. Thank you to Orvie for all the support y'all have given the Adams Fork Working Group. And I'll wrap it up there.
Thanks so much, Mariah. So again, please feel free to drop questions for all of our panelists, Mariah included in the chat and Q&A. And we'll get started with a question for Zane and Eric here about the expansion of ammonia facilities in the U.S. So Matthew Kennedy asks, what explains this expansion of ammonia production in the nation? And is it due to the potential new markets, or is there also an increase in demand for fertilizers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so there are three things going on here. So there's the potential expansion of new market, there's the potential expansion of fertilizer demand, and then there's also the hydrogen tax credit. And I actually think the hydrogen tax credits are the primary driver of this. In the Inflation Reduction Act, they're called the 45V and 45Q tax credits, which incentivize low carbon hydrogen production. And as I showed in that first graphic about how ammonia is produced, ammonia is basically hydrogen production. So um, that's the primary driver. With regard to fertilizer demand, U.S. fertilizer demand is actually kind of stagnant for the last 20 or 30 years. There is a graph on that in the report, which I didn't show in this talk. The growth in fertilizer demand is happening globally outside of the U.S. So yeah, but the primary reason for the huge influx of proposed projects is the hydrogen tax credit and the Inflation Reduction.
Zane, do you mind if I add just a little bit of
Yeah.
additional detail to that? And so, Zane identified sort of three kind of potential drivers for this, and that's the right way to think about it. So fertilizer demand is increasing or projected to increase globally, so that is a growth market. There's a huge the conventional uses of ammonia, which are kind of plastics, explosives, and a few other sort of petrochemical adjacent categories. Those are not growing at a very rapid rate either. Or projected to really, but there is this big question mark, and I think this is really kind of what part of our everyone's attention needs to be, is like, what happens with these kind of new emerging uses for ammonia, whether it's a hydrogen carrier, co-firing with coal, or something similar, a maritime fuel. And there is legitimate debate about how big and how fast those markets will emerge, if they emerge at all. With Zane, I'm quite skeptical that they will emerge at anywhere like the upper end of those ranges, and I think the answer is probably toward the lower end. But the question, which is a good one, I mean, the vast majority of ammonia produced now is for fertilizers. That is the one well-known use case for ammonia, and it's in the U.S. it's simply not growing and hasn't grown for a long time. And so we shouldn't think about this stuff as having much connection at all to agriculture, which is, it's the primary use. It's just the question is like, what happens in the future? How much is it incentivized by federal tax subsidies, basically? So anyway, I'll stop there, but it's a super interesting question to ask.
Thank you both. We've got a question in the chat about the pollution impact of ammonia production beyond just carbon dioxide and also across the supply chain. Zane, could you speak to what that supply chain looks like and what sorts of pollutants frontline communities can expect from ammonia production facilities?
I can, Eric, if you want to jump in on this as well. Yeah. Eric, could you help me out on this one?
Sure. Sorry, what was the question again? I was reading the questions in the chat.
Sure. Eric, this one is in the chat from Miriam, who asks, what are the pollution impacts at ports of using ammonia as a maritime fuel, for example? And again, just the pollution impact beyond carbon pollution specifically.
Yeah, it's a good question too. So this report does not go deep into the air and water quality impacts of ammonia production and use. It looks more at the carbon implications and the economics and markets. Those are very legitimate questions, though. Ammonia, as anyone knows who's used ammonia as a household cleaning product, you don't want to breathe the vapors from it. It can be quite toxic and dangerous at a local level. And ammonia interacts with water in a particularly nasty way that's very harmful to aquatic organisms. And so if you were to have an ammonia spill, certainly in a bay or an ocean, you could imagine a pretty significant die-off in that vicinity. It's super problematic. And so there have to be quite stringent safety measures to keep the ammonia from communicating with the surrounding environment. Again, that's not something that we go into detail in this report. Ours is a much sort of broader overview of kind of industry dynamics and the drivers of those dynamics. But I think for folks who are evaluating an ammonia project that is proposed for their region or their community, I think it would be super important to be very aware of the kind of localized environmental and health impacts from ammonia. And again, that's the ammonia itself. Then there's the stuff that's upstream from that, the manufacture of the hydrogen and the extraction and transport of the natural gas that is used to make the hydrogen. All that stuff has a chain of impacts as well, which again we don't discuss in the report. It's not sort of the focus we have, but super worth digging into that especially if you're concerned with a plant located near your region.
Eric. Mariah, is there anything you'd like to add to that about just general advocacy around health impacts and also opportunities to block gas-fired ammonia projects?
Yeah, I'll just go off of what or add to what Eric said about you can imagine in an ocean what this would look like. I'd also like to talk about local streams and rivers, what that will look like. It's just unimaginable. Um, and what you can do is talk to your decision makers. If you live in West Virginia, please talk to your decision makers. Let them know that West Virginia deserves a just transition, and that includes community input and empowerment.
And we'll just take a moment to say too, Mike Bellevue is in the chat, or Mike Bellevue. Sorry, I always pronounce Mike's name wrong. And he makes a really good point. Mike is an expert in these subjects, and I think people are not fully aware of the localized risk to health and environment from potential accident. He's identified one analysis showing that at a particular facility, you could get an 8-mile long toxic gas cloud. It's not something that you generally want to have anywhere near where you live. So thanks, Mike, for adding that into the chat.
Another thing I'd like to add is in the town where this is proposed for, this community is in the 95 percentile for respiratory illnesses like asthma and black lung as well. So this is not going to be good, especially for this community that's already so incredibly vulnerable.
Thank you. Another question in the chat about the 45Q tax credit for carbon capture and sequestration. Zane, is this tax credit something that is in play in addition to the 45V tax credit for hydrogen production that you mentioned?
Yes, definitely. There's another question about how the Trump administration may impact this, and I think these go right together. And the answer is we don't really know yet. So the 45Q tax credit is the CCS, and that is a tax credit based off of how much you sequester. The 45V tax credit, these are both for hydrogen production specifically. The 45V tax credit has tiers of amount of tax credit based off of how little carbon is used to produce a metric ton of hydrogen. So the exact economics for each specific project on which tax credit would be better for them is different. So yeah, they're both in play. But the thing about these both, it requires verification and accountability and accounting on actually reducing the amount of carbon and like how are we actually counting how much carbon is used to produce this hydrogen and through the hydrogen, the ammonia. Yeah, it's I really don't know how this new administration is going to do that. So that I think these are questions that just require continued monitoring.
Let's see. Right. We've got another question in the chat from Ginger who asks if these plants are, ultimately do not end up being built, do you have any guesses as to how they might be repurposed or what could happen if these market hurdles come together?
Yeah, I think you're right there, Ginger, that it would be hydrogen. because they're basically hydrogen plants. And for all of the blue facilities or proposed blue facilities, it's a way to use natural gas, and it's a way to use natural gas as the rest of the economy hopefully starts to decarbonize at a faster rate. Um, so that's it. I don't know if you want to add anything more on that, Eric.
No, I mean the short answer is like we don't really know what would happen to those facilities. It's a reasonable supposition to think that it would just be used as a hydrogen production facility since it's already doing that important part of the process on site mostly. On the other hand, it's easy to imagine that if those sort of bullish market forecasts don't materialize and the tax credits aren't sufficient to subsidize these things into existence, then you just end up with a mothballed plant or some big piece of industrial infrastructure that isn't producing any jobs or any value for the community. It's just sitting there decommissioned or partially decommissioned at some other. It's like we don't know what will happen, but I do think there's sort of a localized economic risk because any place that's considering building a project like this is assuming that A, there will be robust federal tax credits to support it or tax subsidies to support it into the future, that the ammonia markets will develop in the way that the most optimistic forecasts think, and that there will be all kinds of supporting infrastructure built, not just domestically, but globally. And if those things don't come to pass in the way that the bullish projections are assuming, then you could have a community that's constructed this thing on the belief that it's going to produce some local economic benefit and nothing happens. That's something we've seen play out in other sectors of the petrochemical industry. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if that were to happen. But but again, the short answer is who knows? I mean, it would be kind of uncharted waters.
Thank you both. On this thread of local economic impacts, we've got a question here about how many jobs the plant, specifically the Adams Fork project, is expected to create in Mingo County. And also how folks in the area are responding to this project proposal. So Mariah, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that reception to the plant and what you're hearing about the jobs impact.
Yeah, so Transgas has boasted about the thousands of local construction jobs that this would create, but has yet to give many or really any information about what the facility would look like in terms of hiring local. So we've heard a lot about construction jobs, and that's pretty much the extent of that. But speaking from previous chemical industry development sites, a lot of those jobs are filled by out of state residents that come in to take those jobs. We don't see many chemical engineers here in Southern West Virginia that are ready and willing to take these jobs. So we expect it to be outsourced to folks out of state that will commute or move to work at this facility. And as for what I'm seeing in terms of opposition, folks in this area, they want their coal jobs back. Let's just be frank here. They don't want this new chemical industry development. We've seen what it's done to Charleston and the surrounding areas, the Chemical Valley. We've seen the water crisis in 2014 that has happened due to the chemical industry there. And folks don't want that. I can say across the board at that community meeting, the 60 plus people that were there were not excited. They had lots of concerns and they demanded answers. And a lot of those answers, unfortunately, they need to be directed to Transgas, who has yet to show up in the community and do their due diligence of sharing this information.
Thanks, Mariah. Relatedly, we have another question here about local or state legislation initiatives to block new fossil hydrogen or ammonia projects. Is that something that's on your radar at all?
It definitely is. And if there's anything I can share with y'all, I'll definitely be sending it to the group.
Thank you. Let's see, we've got a question in the Q&A about co-location. Ben Cross asks if we've looked into the benefits of co-locating industries that can be synergistically integrated to minimize emissions and water use by applying circular economy concepts and technologies versus standalone ammonia facilities?
The short answer is no. I haven't looked into that in this report. That's intriguing to me. I think at the simplest, just to, at the simplest level though, with these ammonia, especially the blue ammonia plants, it's just thinking about this as another way to use natural gas, um, and and all of the emissions that go with that, and community health effects, as Mariah was talking about. So that's just kind of how I look at it, and whether or not there's enough the CCS technology advances enough to actually make this low carbon, is the big open question in my mind.
Thanks, Zane. To the question of accountability around the 45Q tax credit for carbon sequestration, Richard asks if 45V has the same problem for ensuring that these tax credits are really used for real decarbonization.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about the accounting, right? That's the thing. And so how are you verifying? I think there's four tiers to the 45V, and it's 4 kilograms CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen, I think is I could be getting the numbers wrong. I don't have them right in front of me. But the point is there's tiers, right? And so it's how do you do the accounting of what the emissions are? So there's a ton of ways that you could make that accounting go up or go down depending on how you do it and how you regulate it and who the regulators are and what the administration is saying, how we want to count these different things. So yeah, there's a huge potential there. Um, I think, I mean, I'm just kind of riffing now, but the idea makes sense. We want to incentivize low carbon production of things. It's the application that may or may not end up working.
But I'll just, make an observation that's not intended to be political, but just an observation that the administration does not seem to be investing in a lot of regulatory and oversight capacity so that you would have an adequate staff that would be able to interpret Treasury guidance around the accounting standards and then carefully measure and monitor the way the facilities are working. That does not seem to be an approach that they're taking at this moment. So it makes me very skeptical that that the industry would be held to the kind of stringency that you would expect, that you would hope to see based on the existing law and Treasury guidance. And we also know that the industry has come out, or the administration rather, has come out with some, very unequivocal statements about their interest in supporting the oil and gas industry. So, sort of more reason to think that the application of this stuff may not be as kind of fair-minded and accurate as the original legislation suggested it would be.
Thank you both. We've got a question in the Q&A about demand for fertilizer and how that might change in the future. Jake Mogan asks, are there data characterizing which segments of the agricultural industry use the greatest volumes of fertilizer in reference to the interplay of carbon pipelines in the Midwestern plains connecting ethanol facilities with carbon capture?
There may be. We didn't go that far down the rabbit hole with this report. One of the things with drafting this report was trying to keep the scope kind of narrow, and if we went down every rabbit hole we could, we would never it would never get done. It would never get written. So yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
It is a good question, and Jake, we're happy to follow up with some more detailed response to that because I think it points to one of the kind of strange but emerging components of the industry. Our co-author, Julia Stone's not able to be on the call with us today, but she really brings sort of an expertise with the agricultural side of this and the fertilizer side of this. So I wouldn't be surprised if she knows the answer to this question off the top of her head, but like I said, she's not able to be with us this morning, but we'll get back to you with an answer to that, or at least a partial one.
Mariah, we have a question about where the injection well for the Adams Fork project might be located. I know there's still a lot of uncertainty about those project details.
Yeah, what I can share is it's not entirely clear at this time, but West Virginia just received primacy for Class 6 injection wells. So I expect in the coming days we'll figure out more.
Another question here about just next steps from this research. What's our next, field of analysis now that this report has been published?
One thing that I would be really interested in looking more into is kind of quantifying the potential for hydrogen ammonia as a hydrogen carrier, like really looking at like what is the energy loss with each time this is transitioned from hydrogen to ammonia, transport back to hydrogen, more transport. Like what are the potential end use cases that really make sense for that? That's something that I think would be really interesting to know and very useful in defining like what potential a new hydrogen economy really has, because this has been talked about. Hydrogen economy has been talked about for 20 years, and it's still being talked about as like a potential for the future. And there's real potential there. So I think that that is something that I would be really interested in looking at. But yeah.
And I think another answer to that question is we'd love to hear from folks on this call and folks who are working on these issues locally about where they have questions or where they see the industry going, or sort of other issues that people feel need a kind of a more fulsome analysis to understand and address. And so we'd very much welcome kind of feedback, thoughts, ideas for kind of where to take this research next. And I think we've gotten some really thoughtful and helpful ideas already in this call.
I see a hand raised from Corinne Van Dalen. Corinne, do you have a question for our panelists? I will go ahead and unmute you if you'd like to ask or raise a comment. And if not, please again, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A here. And please do reach out with ideas for new research. I will drop my contact information in the chat, and I'm happy to put you in touch with our research team for further questions, for research ideas, ways to get this in front of policymakers and in front of folks in your community. I'm seeing we have another question here in the chat about, yeah, just about, right, organizing efforts around 45V as a waste of taxpayer money, and ways to really take this research and turn it into a tool for advocacy. And I'm curious, Mariah, if you have any thoughts about what this report means for you and what you're working on in coming weeks and months as these projects develop.
Yeah, it's incredibly convoluted, the information between the tax credits. And I think what's important is getting this information, this reliable, accurate information is such a powerful tool for people to be able to realize or understand and know what this means for them and their community. I think that's powerful.
Thank you. A question in the chat about how the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has influenced the ammonia market. Any thoughts there, Zane or Eric?
I don't have a concise answer in this. I don't think Ukraine or Russia were one of the primary producers of ammonia. I'm trying to remember what the list of countries, the top countries were after the US. I don't think they were on there. So I don't think it's made a huge impact on ammonia prices. I know that it did impact food prices because Ukraine produced a lot of grain. Um, yeah, yeah, that's all I've got there.
Isabel, I'll look into it and see if I can get an answer to you. I don't know off the top of my head either, but it's an interesting one. Like any global commodity, I mean, one of there are always going to be geopolitical factors that affect the price, and that certainly was a major disruption to many fossil fuel markets, especially gas-based markets like in Europe. So it's a good question.
Well, unless there are any further questions or comments today, I'd like to thank you all so much, Zane, Eric, and Mariah, for joining us today and for sharing about your work and your research. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. I'll make sure to send around a link to this recording, a link to Zane's slide deck, and to the report itself in a follow-up email later this afternoon. And yep, thank you again for joining us today, and we hope you have a good one. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.